They rented a ballroom with LED panels and fake ferns, polished everything to a shine, and called it innovation. I stood near the back, close enough to see the stage, far enough to avoid being in the group photos. The warehouse system I'd spent 2 years building was now their crown jewel, and tonight it got its coronation. Lucas Brent. My manager stepped onto the podium to polite applause. His suit was tailored, his grin sharp. This success, he said, pausing for dramatic effect, is thanks to the incredible work of our integration team. I'd like to especially thank Janet Ron, and of course our visionary DevOps lead, Dennis Carter. The crowd clapped. I didn't. My glass of lukewarm, sparkling cider trembled just slightly in my hand. Dennis hadn't touched a line of code in months. Ruby, the controller, quietly orchestrating every robot, every scan cycle, every predictive loop on that warehouse floor, wasn't even mentioned. Neither was I, unless you counted the butchered version of my name on the project banner flashing behind the stage. Congrats to the automation team led by Dennis Carter and team members Alira Vans, Cami Tran, Mark W. Alira Vans. Like I was a typo in my own legacy. I raised my glass in mock salute, then sipped the warm fizz. No one noticed. They were too busy congratulating each other, talking about IPO timing and scalability like they'd done anything but present PowerPoints. Ruby kept everything running. She had for months. Her heartbeat was the only reason their demo last week hadn't turned into a PR disaster. The irony, they didn't even know she wasn't theirs. Ruby wasn't company property. No procurement order, no asset log, no record in the IT database. Just a blinking black box tucked behind a row of servers, humming quietly like she always did. A ghost in their machine. Someone nudged past me with a flute of champagne and I stepped back into the shadows. I didn't need recognition. I had something better. Leverage. The lights dimmed for a highlight reel. Robot arms spinning, conveyor belts dancing, Lucas beaming on screen like a messiah of logistics. I watched with a strange detachment, as if observing someone else's success from behind glass. They thought they'd built a miracle, but miracles don't run on borrowed time forever. The calendar pinged at 9:03 a.m. with the subject line, HR Transition Discussion. No name, no details. Just a location. Small conference 2 and a meeting length of 15 minutes. They didn't even have the courtesy to pretend it was a check-in. I knew before I sat down. Marcy Denton from HR greeted me with the same voice she probably used for engagement parties and exit interviews. She had a manila folder in front of her, a tight smile, and a pen that didn't work until I smacked it twice on the table. Just want to say thank you for all your incredible work, Alira. You've truly set the foundation for the next chapter of this company, she said, like we were sharing a milestone, not a firing. Lucas wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. There's no severance, she added. Technically, your role was project-based, though we understand it may not have been framed that way when you started. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for clarification. I signed. One stroke after another, slicing clean through the illusion I'd let myself believe that merit meant security, that success meant belonging. There was no audit, no checklist. No one asked for passwords or asset logs. No one mentioned the controller humming in Dock 3, the one blinking every 30 seconds like a heartbeat. No one questioned how it got there, who maintained it, who knew its core code. They were so eager to push me out, they forgot to ask what I'd taken in. Ruby wasn't theirs. She never had been. Her firmware was registered under Vance Logic Systems, LLC, My LLC. She ran on a 30-day soft license loop, quietly checking for a remote renewal code embedded in her core. If it failed, she would not protest. She would simply stop. I stood, shook Marcy's hand, and offered a polite smile. Thanks for everything I said. Then I walked out of that office with an empty badge, a clear mind, and a private server, waiting at home for one simple command. 5 years ago, I rented a storage unit behind a Jiffy Lube for $89 a month. It smelled like motor oil and mildew, but it had a locking door and enough space for a soldering table and a second-hand chair. That's where Ruby was born. She didn't come from schematics drafted in a think tank or a team brainstorming session with coffee-fueled whiteboards. She came from long nights, burned fingertips, and instinct. I pieced her together on the floor, surrounded by old circuit boards, thrifted wiring, and caffeine-soaked silence. Every chip, every resistor, every line of code came from me. Not from Elira, the employee. From Elira, the builder, the owner. I didn't name her Ruby out of sentimentality. I named her because she bled for every test run, every voltage spike, every fried controller she replaced, just like I had. After the prototype stabilized, I incorporated Vance Logic Systems, LLC. I registered the intellectual property. I filed the paperwork like I was preparing for war. I had blueprints in a fireproof safe and backups stored across 3 states, because I knew what happened when you didn't prepare. I knew what happened when you trusted people who saw your ideas as free labor. They took. Every job before had ended the same. I built something real. They buried me under someone else's name. This time I stayed quiet. I played long. When I joined the company, I didn't offer Ruby. I waited. I watched them fumble with supplier modules that overheated and shorted out like wet matches. I waited until the 3rd system meltdown, then casually suggested I test something custom. No procurement form, no asset registration, no PO number. I carried her in my backpack and installed her during a dead shift with no one watching. Ruby synced perfectly on first boot. And no one asked where she came from because all they cared about was that she worked. So I let them forget she wasn't theirs. I let them believe in their own myth while Ruby quietly ran their empire from the shadows. By week 2, the headlines had turned breathless. Revolutionary fulfillment system built in-house. The future of logistics has arrived. Behind the scenes with the CEO who automated everything. Photos of the warehouse showed rows of synchronized bots gliding like ballerinas. The same bots Ruby kept in perfect harmony. The same harmony they now claimed was their creation. LinkedIn exploded with self-congratulations. Lucas posted a picture of himself beside a mock-up of the floor layout, arms crossed like he'd coded it from scratch. Janet from marketing called it a triumph of collaboration. The CEO made his media rounds speaking with the kind of polished detachment reserved for people who had never once watched a test drone burst into flames at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not one of them mentioned Ruby. I sat on my couch in sweatpants, half watching the live stream from the launch gala, while my cat needed a blanket beside me. They unveiled a 3D model of the system complete with tiny plastic drones, circling fake inventory shelves like clockwork angels. They toasted to innovation, and I just watched the clock. Ruby's heartbeat loop was quietly ticking, embedded deep in her core. A private signal she sent every 30 days to my remote server. If the ping succeeded, she continued as normal. If it failed, she would enter the first stage of shutdown. A soft one, polite, even just a nudge to remind them what they'd forgotten. The renewal server sat on a dedicated box in my apartment, humming beside my router. I checked its logs once that week. Ping received. Countdown active. 28 days remaining. They thought they'd bought brilliance with a severance-free exit and a recycled HR script. They thought the system would run forever because it had survived the demo. But they didn't know that the soul of their shiny new empire beat inside a machine that answered only to me. And Ruby never missed a heartbeat until I told her to. By day 23, the silence began to crack. It started small, just friction. A few robots missing their shelf markers, a pallet arriving 5 minutes later than it should have, a scan that didn't sync right away, barely noticeable if you weren't watching closely. But Cammie was watching. They're nervous, she texted me late that afternoon. Someone's blaming the firmware again. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening. Ruby's heartbeat ping had gone unanswered for 7 days. That meant the first internal throttle routine kicked in packet delay at 5%. Nothing fatal, just enough to blur the edges, to make the system feel off. By 10 a.m. the next day, the emails started. Hi, Elira. Hope you're well. Quick question, was there ever a formal asset transfer filed for the sync module you implemented? Hi again, just following up. We're closing out documentation for the quarter. Could you confirm if any proprietary components were used? Wanted to clarify something for finance? The controller unit used in Phase 3 was that developed in-house or externally sourced. I marked them all unread and let them sit. They weren't looking for answers. Not yet. They were looking for ways to cover themselves in case something broke. At 1:17 a.m. that night, I logged into Ruby's root interface. The script was already waiting. I adjusted the next threshold packet delay to 8%. Sync deviation margin widened slightly. She'd still function, still look flawless from the outside, but internally, she'd be straining. I left a single log message in the update metadata. Heartbeat unconfirmed. Proceeding with conservation protocol. They should have asked questions a week ago. They should have noticed the blinking light in Dock 3 was running on trust, not entitlement. Cammy pinged me again the next morning. Lucas told Ite to just reboot the controller. Nothing changed. I sipped my coffee and opened Ruby's diagnostics console. Everything was green except the timer, now sitting at 6 days and 13 hours. The lull before the storm had officially begun. On the morning of day 30, Ruby stopped asking. The renewal ping failed at 3:04 a.m. As expected, no handshake, no fallback, no override. She waited the programmed grace period 12 minutes, then initiated Phase 2. At 3:17, she began to dim her sync threads. The warehouse AI interpreted it as a calibration lag. By 4:02, conveyor belts began to stall in staggered waves, not enough to trigger alarms, but just enough to interrupt rhythm. Forklifts paused mid-shift. Drones idled with inventory still clutched in their clamps. A quarter pallet of weighted blankets sat motionless in the middle of Lane 4 for 9 straight minutes. The VP of Operations was called in at 5:15. He arrived angry and half-shaven. By 5:34, he was shouting into his headset. By 5:50, Arid had tried 3 hard reboots, all of which failed. Ruby accepted the commands with a polite nod and did absolutely nothing. At 6:12, Cammy sent me a photo of the incident board, 19 open alerts. They've got no clue what's wrong, she messaged. Eastland Freight's team was scheduled for a full site tour at 10:00 a.m. They canceled at 7:03. At 7:45, the internal systems chat was flooded with screenshots of error codes and frozen metrics. Someone tagged Lucas in a desperate thread titled, "Urgent Fulfillment Desync Root Cause Unknown." By 8:22, I had 3 new emails in my inbox. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window. A squirrel outside had gotten itself tangled in a rogue plastic bag. It spun in frustrated circles, tail flicking, completely unaware of how ridiculous it looked. I watched it fight, the wind, watched the bag wrap tighter around its body, and thought of Lucas. Ruby was quiet now, still powered, still present, but waiting. The silence wasn't a crash, it was precision, it was obedience. She wasn't failing. She was doing exactly what I'd taught her to do. I glanced at the server logs one more time, then shut the lid of my laptop. The next move was theirs. I printed the contract on ivory cardstock, heavy enough to demand respect before a single word was read. It was the same template I'd been drafting quietly for months, tucked away in the same folder where I kept scanned NDA's firmware specs and the original prototype photos from the storage unit. Licensor Vance Logic Systems, LLC, licensee company name redacted. Term $60,000 month. Payment upfront only. Ownership 100% retained by licensor. No duplication, no sub-licensing. Default clause, remote shutdown. No refunds. I signed it in blue ink, then folded it into a black envelope and slipped in a sticky note. Ruby is watching. Countdown active. It was addressed to Meredith Howlerin, General Counsel. I mailed it that afternoon with a calm steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. Not revenge, not triumph, just clarity. The first reply came via email 2 days later. Hi, Alira, hope you're well. Would you be open to a quick 15-minute check-in to align on options and ensure mutual understanding? Looking forward to collaborating. Best Greg from Legal. I didn't respond. The next one came with more teeth. Hi again. We're eager to resolve any misunderstandings regarding the integration module and related ownership. Please advise next steps to avoid disruption. I declined the meeting invite and archived the message. They were still pretending I might come back quietly, that this was a simple matter of clarification, that I was some junior engineer who forgot to log her assets. But I wasn't. And Ruby wasn't theirs. Cammie texted me a screenshot that same night. Another 3-hour sync gap logged in their fulfillment system. No fix, no explanation. Ruby's diagnostics were still green, quiet, controlled. But the clock I'd included at the bottom of the contract was ticking down in real time. 7 days left. They tried to rebuild her. Cammie told me Lucas had called in a crisis team, hardware engineers, contract coders, and a very expensive consultant with a resume full of acronyms, but no warehouse dirt under his nails. Their plan was simple: swap Ruby out with a third-party module, spoof the data flows, and pray the system didn't notice. Ruby noticed. The replacement controller triggered a sync mismatch within minutes. Then came the cascade. Aisle drones began stuttering, recalculating their routes mid-spin. One clipped a shelving unit. Another tried to rescan the same QR code 34 times before rebooting itself into a loop. 3 crashed completely. Cammie sent me a photo of the aftermath. One drone on its sidearm twisted, still holding a tote of Halloween costumes. A child-sized vampire cape hung off its claw like a strange surrender flag. The warehouse had turned into a silent graveyard of blinking lights and static screens. The CTO, a man who once tried to explain machine learning to me using a metaphor about pizza toppings, was fired by the end of the day. No one could find documentation for Ruby. No procurement order, no code base, nothing in the dev logs. She had arrived like a ghost, done her job flawlessly, and then just as quietly started to disappear. They brought in IT to dig for backups, but all they found was a single ping log 30 days prior from an IP address that wasn't on their network. They finally understood. They hadn't built her. They hadn't even bothered to ask who had. And now, with the Eastland freight team preparing to revisit the facility in less than a week, they were staring at a system they couldn't fix, couldn't replicate, and couldn't explain. I watched from home, logged into Ruby's diagnostics as she hovered at 83% load, fully stable, heartbeat paused. They were out of options. And I was just getting started. The call came late Friday afternoon. Cleveland number. I almost let it go to voicemail, Denise Lucas said, voice tight. It's Lucas. I didn't say anything. They'll agree to anything. What do you want? He sounded tired. Not apologetic, just exhausted, like a man who'd been forced to admit gravity was real after years of pretending to float. I already had the terms written. 6-month contract, triple my previous salary, full access, no restrictions, no NDAs, private lockable office. System remains the sole property of Vance Logic Systems. No transfer, no clone rights, no exceptions. I emailed the document before the call ended. PDF signed. Attached to it was a countdown clock still ticking. 2 days left. He read it in silence. I could hear the scroll of his mouse wheel. You really wrote this like a war general. No, I said. I wrote it like someone who remembers how they treated me when they thought they didn't need me. There was no argument, no defense. Just the quiet click of his breath catching in his throat. We'll sign it, he said. I'll make sure of it. And he did. Monday morning, I walked back through the same glass doors they'd once pushed me out of. This time, I wasn't escorted by HR. There was no pre-printed badge with my name spelled wrong. Instead, they handed me a plastic access card. It had one word on it, clean and bold. Owner. Lucas met me in the lobby. He didn't try to shake my hand. Upstairs, someone from R&D started to give me a rundown of the recovery plan they'd devised over the weekend. I let him talk for 3 minutes. Then I plugged in my encrypted drive, authenticated my secure handshake, and watched Ruby come back to life. Heartbeat restored. Sync stabilized in under 90 seconds. Conveyor belts rolled. Drones moved. The room exhaled like they'd just avoided a plane crash. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just turned to them and said, "Now let's talk about the mess you've made." The room was full of people who had once walked past me without seeing me. Now they stood still, watching every movement I made. I inserted the secure key into the server terminal. Ruby recognized it instantly. Heartbeat resumed handshake, complete. 1 blink, then 2. Then she purred back to life like nothing had ever gone wrong. Within 90 seconds, sync efficiency surged from 12% to 99.8%. I watched the dashboard stabilize in real time. Queues cleared, bots realigned. Their system hummed again, but only because I said so. A low murmur swept across the room. Relief. Awe. A quiet kind of fear. Lucas didn't speak. Neither did the new acting CTO, some anxious interim from R&D, who had been hired in a panic and now looked like he wished he'd stayed in school another year. I stepped away from the console, adjusted the cable, and turned to face them. "Let me be clear," I said. "You didn't bring me back. You didn't fix this. You didn't save your rollout." I looked directly at the CEO, who stood near the door, eyes wide and mouth shut for once. "You rented me." No one interrupted. "You rented the system. You rented the person who built it. And from this moment on, every second of uptime is not a gift. It's a transaction." I let the silence stretch. They didn't argue. They nodded quickly and quietly. People who had once dismissed me now waited for instructions. I wasn't their employee anymore. I was the storm they tried to forget, the name they mispronounced, the ghost in their machine who wrote the heartbeat and the kill switch. I turned back to the screen, checked the logs, and watched Ruby settle into perfect rhythm. No gloating, no fury, just control. They didn't just rent the system, they rented me.